So I am Shannon Christofferson, and I am the manager of Data and Information Services at the Arctic Institute of North America. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to our speaker series. As most of you know, our speaker series runs monthly from September through April. And our next speaker series will be February 21st with Gerald Bigelow, just to remind you all. As another reminder, we will again have a reception after this talk, which will be held at ANA on the 10th floor of Earth Sciences. So I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Chui-Ling Tam. Dr. Tam is an assistant professor here at the University of Calgary in the Department of Geography. Her research concerns the spatial politics of environmental communication and its effects on public participation in environmental and resource management decision-making and implementation. She has a particular interest in maritime communities, and she is currently conducting a project comparing climate change communication in Southeast Asia and the Canadian Arctic, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing her. Dr. Tam.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. I know 4 to 5 p.m. on a Wednesday is not the easiest time for people to show up, so I appreciate your appearing today. I'm going to be talking about climate change communication. I'm not talking about climate change deliberately, but it tends to sneak in this topic. And the title of my talk is Learning to Listen Further Strands of Climate Change in the Qaujimajatugangi Nunavut. And I've deliberately put this picture up here of a number of fishing cabins near the hamlet of Cambridge Bay at the base of Mount Pelly, so Mount Avayuk, because if you want to talk to Inuit in the springtime, you need to walk out here. You're not going to find them in town. And I spent a lot of time trying to find people when I was up in Nunavut. So without further ado, I'll just try to follow the slides, because otherwise I'll end up distracting myself. What I'm going to present today is basically an Arctic research story. I'm a bit of a storyteller, so I always talk about stories, and I think of research as just really good storytelling. It's good story data gathering. So this is an Arctic research story about climate change communication and its effective geography. So I'm looking at geographies of emotion, of perception. And this story also is one of research adaptation, because I got up to Cambridge Bay nearly 2 years ago now. I've spent 2 seasons up in the Arctic, and I found it really hard to get everyone to talk to me. It's sort of awkward to walk up to people and say, hey, you want to talk to me about climate change? So I had to sort of really figure out how I was going to do this. So I spent a lot of time walking. These hamlets of 2,000 people, I just spent every day walking through the dust storms and the rain and the mud, and being waved at by Inuit and being offered rides, because no one could believe I was walking so much. And in fact, I was walking so much that I've heard anecdotally that I've acquired a nickname in Nunavut as a result of 2 seasons up there. And I don't know what the Nunavut word is, but apparently I've been given the nickname the lady who walks a lot. So I'm known for walking, and this research story is also a story of walking, but also a detour through caribou as I tried to look for people to talk to me. And it's a story of the land, because the land features in everything when you talk to the Inuit. And it's also a story of representation, because what I'm concerned is about how representations of Arctic peoples are communicated out in that wider world of climate change governance. So ultimately, this is a story about Arctic communication space as something local in the Arctic, but also something that's connected to these much wider fields of communication. And as you can see here, this is a picture of me. I was in my desperation to find someone to talk to, and my joy in meeting someone who actually wanted to talk to me, I followed the town reporter out to the fishing grounds over by the gravel pits. And she was very clever, because by the end of my $170 return taxi fare to drive the 10 minutes to the gravel pits, I was also carrying all the camp chairs and a bag of a butchered seal meat that was left on the beach to share for gatherers. And this is a picture of me basically hard at work doing social science research. So how did this start? Basically, I'm interested in tensions in climate change discourse. And this emerged from my first visits to the global climate change negotiations of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So I was there in Paris in 2015 during the really big talks that determined the binding agreement on what, trying to reach 1.5 degrees, but we'd settle for 2 in the meantime. And I was really uncomfortable with how peripheral communities, marginal communities, maritime communities were or were not represented in this climate change discourse. So I want to know how these maritime communities are actually situated in that global climate change discourse. How are they imagined? What is their place to influence the conversation? So who and where are they? How are they actually adequately represented? How do they respond to climate change? And I wanted to move beyond the sort of photogenic opportunities where you'd have someone at the climate negotiations dressed up in their tribal gear handing a paddle to the UNFCCC executive secretary. So I didn't feel that was an adequate way to represent them. And also in climate change, in the last 3 global climate change negotiations I've attended now, usually there is an indigenous group of people, and most of them are from forests. And then there are Pacific SIDS actors, and they're considered to be the marine portion, if you want. And Arctic representation, in terms of Arctic peoples there, I haven't really spotted too many. Right? I'm not sure where they fit into the picture. So I wanted to ask this, and I wanted to ask also, how do they respond to climate change in climate change communication? Are they adapting to climate change voluntarily, because that language of adaptation is very strong out there? But is adaptation about mitigation, basically stuff that you plan to do to ward off the effects of change, or something that you have to do because you're already facing change? Right? And because I'm a geographer, I wanted to understand how those physical and social geographies of the places people inhabit actually affect their opportunities and their sense of entitlement to actual engagement in that political process. So what I'm doing is, I'm going to try this pointer now. I started my research started in Cambridge Bay, just on the southern tip of Victoria Island right here. So it's right at the on the Northwest Passage. And then because of some of the things I was hearing from people I talked to, I moved westward by about 400 kilometers and came to Kuluktuk, which is on the mainland, just outside the boundary of the Northwest Territories. And this research project that I'm working on is actually in the world's 2 largest archipelagos. So the largest archipelago is actually Indonesia, and that's where I have done research for the last 15 years, 17 years. And the Arctic is the 2nd largest archipelago. And what I'm looking at is, are there ways we can look at these sort of spatial and social geographies and look at how communities organize in these marine areas? Right. So expanding study sites. So Cambridge Bay, as you can see, it's pretty small. It's a hamlet, but this is actually a central place. This is the urban mecca of Western Nunavut. Right? This is where kids go from the smaller outlying communities with a couple of hundred people, and they come here to hit the city life. Right? This Cambridge Bay is a big deal, and it's a population now that's probably about a quarter or a third not Inuit. They're Southerners. That's the term that's used for people from the outside. And it's basically a government town. There's lots of civic offices in the town of Cambridge Bay. It's got a diversifying economy. It's a vertical economy. It's one where there's a lot of economic diversity and lots of economic hierarchy that's emerging in a town like Cambridge Bay. And its local HTO, the Hunters and Trappers organizations, were originally set up as sort of representative bodies in each of their communities. But the way the HTO is involved has evolved is that it's very much a commercial enterprise now. It's sort of the key liaison point for researchers coming in. It makes a lot of money training hunters to act as guides for researchers as well. So it's important in various ways. Oh, this doesn't work as anything but a pointer. Because of what I found, I also decided in the second season I went up to go over to Kuluktuk. And Kuluktuk is on the Coppermine River. This is Kuluktuk right after Easter. This is a river. This is where the frolics happen every spring. It's got about 6 feet of ice under there. And it's a slightly smaller community, and economic diversity is more limited because it's far away from that government wealth, from those central places, and it's very much what people told me was a traditional community. It relies very much on hunting and trapping and fishing for its livelihood. It's still one that people on a large scale actually hunt for the whole community and share. And it also has strong ties with Cambridge Bay. And its local HTO is a little different from what I heard. Again, this HTO is really respected as a moral and political leader. And I was attracted to Kuluktuk because I met some of these guys when they were in Cambridge Bay for these caribou hearings, and they were just incredibly outspoken and belligerent, and I thought I need to find out what drives these people. So that's how I ended up in Kuluktuk. So anyway, this started with I guess 2016 now. So June 2016, I went to Cambridge Bay. I arrived there thinking, here I am in the Arctic. Everyone knows about climate change. I got up there and I found no one to talk to. I tried over and over again, and this lasted for a while. And the thing is that among the interviews I had, and eventually I talked to various people with the HTO, the Kitungu Inuit Association, various people I would find off the street, people that would stop me in the hamlet offices and say, yeah, I've seen you walking around for the last 2 weeks. What are you doing here? Is that poor lady lost? And then I'd say, well, this is what I'm here for. And then depending on who I was talking to, they would just launch into why we don't talk about climate change, right? Or actually how we should talk about climate change. And this is the main message I was getting from the people I talked to. It's not representative, it's indicative. But a lot of the responses were, we should talk about climate change, but we don't talk about climate change. And the one that floored me was, what is climate change? And are you serious? I think you must know what climate change is. So what they did say was, we don't talk about climate change, but we talk about the weather. And then I would hear all these stories about the weather, right? But well, that's going forward a little bit. But what they did say, among the things I picked up, was that a lot of people who were in the community would say, well, you know, if you want to talk about climate change, it's because you want to know what climate change is happening, so you should go talk to our elders. They're the ones who know. You don't need to talk to us. We don't have anything to say because we don't know enough. So you should talk to our elders. But the definition of an elder is shifting, right? So I was there trying to find out, well, who's an elder? Right? And I'd be told all sorts of different things. Now, one, you could look at really old people, right? Really old, bent people, right? And there were several. If you know you got someone really old when they're sort of shuffling around and they look like, you know, they could use your help, and not that they really do necessarily, but some elders are these really old members who've been around for the last 70, 80 years, and they've seen a lifetime of experience, and that's an elder. But then there were some that would be, I was told also, that an elder is someone who's 50 years old and is starting to get some sort of old age security, right? Okay, well, that's quite a different translation of elder from what I understand. And then others would say, you know, actually, an elder is just someone with gray hair, right? So I started dyeing my hair, right? Because I didn't want to be an elder. I was actually at a Mother's Day celebration where they handed me a flower automatically because they figured, oh, I must be old enough to be a parent. So I said, okay, don't give me the pink rose because that's for a real elder. But also, the other people also pointed out that, well, maybe you're asking people in the wrong place, because Cambridge Bay is sheltered. We have a more temperate climate. We don't have the same kind of extremes because we're right on the Northwest Passage and we're in the middle of Victoria Island. So maybe you should go somewhere else where there's more variation. Maybe you should go to Baffin Island or go out closer to the edges of Nunavut. Right. And on top of that, Cambridge Bay is not as traditional because we have a waged economy here. Right. It's one where people are, they don't have to depend on the land. They can go shop out and have meals out. There are people in Cambridge Bay who are flying out down to Texas to watch Adele perform and then fly back up again for a weekend. Right. So some people have lots of money up here. So I thought, okay, what am I going to do? Here I am. I've spent, $5,000 to get here. I'm in the middle of Cambridge Bay, and I'm not finding people to talk to me about climate. And I was really aware that I couldn't really sort of intervene and inject myself into people's presence and say, I want you to talk about climate to me, right? So these were ethical considerations around research as a colonial exercise, research as an intervention in people's lives, and also research as something that generated research fatigue, because all of these communities are studied a lot, right? And so recruitment was very sluggish. And it's pretty much what I expected, because when you do Indigenous work like this, you really don't expect to land there and be able to just be embraced by the community for weeks. And it usually happens, as it happened in Cambridge Bay, that at the end of my 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks in, that's when people started to talk to me. So I had to squeeze it all in the last two and a half days, pretty much. And indeed, I actually had 3 interviews on the day right before I had to fly. The last one ended at 11 at night. It was very frustrating. Oh no, actually, that was the second last one. There was another one in the morning before I flew. While I was there, I also started talking to the various management boards up there, and at some of them, they pointed out, well, there's actually caribou hearings in town, and if you want to meet people, maybe you should just show up and say hello, hang around. And I thought, well, I could use this as an opportunity to connect. I have no interest in caribou, and I don't want to, because that's a whole other minefield. But it was a chance to, I was there. Right? I had a chance to find out something that I didn't expect, and so borrowing from Chambers' ideas about research nomadism and basically research flexibility and adaptation, accept that you don't know much about what's going on and just go and see what you can find. Okay, so I was up there after challenging the dust storms and all this other stuff. I found myself in this scintillating place, which is the community hall in Cambridge Bay. And it's a pretty typical meeting format. I've got a whole other paper talking about what happened here, but I wanted to pull out a few things here that are germane to this presentation, which is that basically I was interested in the communication priorities and how this sort of played out in terms of getting some understanding of what was the communication environment to talk about environmental problems in Cambridge Bay, right? So I went there and I listened to these 4 days of meetings, 12 hours a day, so 48 hours later, they ran from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And because I had nothing better to do and I didn't know how to interject, given all these people were really busy and very exhausted after 4 12-hour days, I just hung around for all of it. So I just listened. I just tried to see where, I tried to hear where climate change came up in conversation. So the biologists, basically their language, if you want, their form of storytelling was through all these maps, reams and reams of maps, 20 pages of maps thrown up on PowerPoint, lots of charts, lots of dots showing caribou patterns, and all of this information was tracked remotely with Global Positioning System colors. And they were basically getting this information fed to their computers at their offices in Yellowknife, right? Now the Inuit told stories differently, right? When it was their turn to actually address the group, they would start by telling stories. So they would start by not talking about, what numbers of caribou are here or here. They would start by talking about things such as what the caribou meant to them, what they learned from their parents. They would talk about how the caribou was part of this community exercise in hunting and sharing, Right? They would talk about caribou in the context of the change that they've seen over their lifetimes in patterns of hunting, access to food, what it's meant for how the community has evolved and changed. And they were really talking from experience. Right? And I was listening to this, and what I heard was science meeting indigenous knowledge. I'm going to mangle this term, I'm going to try it anyway. Qaujimajatugangi, something like that, I think. Right? I've been practicing the Inuktitut word for IQ for a while. But what I heard was they had their science locked down, but in their terms. So the Inuit hunters who were there would be questioning the science, right? Basically saying, are they really disappearing? And they kept referring to cycles. And the cycles, they wouldn't just say, well, the caribou move around in 75-year cycles. Everything moves around in 60 or 75-year cycles. And I never heard an exact number for where the cycles were, but a cycle is tied to how you know that an elder is a really important person who's got that knowledge because they've lived long enough to live through a cycle, right? And so they were talking about caribou cycles, and they were talking about climate change cycles. They were talking about cycles of plenty and cycles of starvation. And they were really challenging the science in terms of other things that could cause this to happen. So they invoked mining roads in terms of their impact on migration routes of caribou. Was that happening? They talked about predation, right? And the conversation, was very close to saying, let's go and kill wolves, which won't really work in Canada very much. It's not, it's a bit of a PR nightmare to go there. But they certainly talked about how in the old days, we engaged in predator management much more than we do now, right? They talked about food preferences because caribou are picky eaters. If you talk to Inuit, they will tell you how they ate this caribou from a particular island or a particular region in Nunavut. They can identify where the caribou was from and what they fed on, basically, from the taste of the caribou, right? I obviously don't have this skill. And they questioned the methodology as well, right? They questioned the methodology of tracking collars and remotely collected data. And a number of them said, well, you're not looking in the right place for the caribou. You're not there at the right time or the right place, so you don't know. And I'm not taking a position on this because I absolutely don't have any way of being able to tell. But what I was interested in is that there were these different stories emerging, right? And climate change just snuck in there. About once a day or twice a day, there would be somebody who started asking, and what's climate change's effect on this? So it wasn't overt, but it was always present, right? This conversation about climate change, right? So I determined after talking to various people about how they talked about weather instead of climate, that actually we need to start looking for these furtive strands of climate change in these everyday stories about hunting. Right. We need to, acknowledge the fact that people are aware that the caribou are declining. There's a new total allowable harvest quota on caribou hunting in Quluktuk and the Cambridge Bay area now, right? And they're aware of all sorts of change that's happening. They're aware that disease is emerging in the Arctic and is affecting the robustness of muskox and how they are easier to catch because their lungs are not carrying them as far. They can't run as fast, right? But this is the result of possibly pathogens emerging as climate change is affecting the land, right? Trappers are getting fewer pelts because the animals aren't showing up at the right time or because the grounds are harder to get to over the ice. Right. Arctic char, what I heard last summer when I was in Cambridge Bay and Quluktuk is that no one had Arctic char in their freezers because they didn't catch enough. And no one knows for sure whether they're disappearing, not evidently because the Continuo Foods, which processes and exports Arctic char, had a great season, but they closed up shop way too early because the char was still running. So people are not fishing at the right time to catch fish, right? They're missing the seasons, right? Economic development increase in predators. These are all issues that they're worried about. They're certainly worried about grizzly bears in town, but they're not worried at all about polar bears. From what I picked up, no one is worried about polar bears among the people I talk to. Right? And this picture here is actually this larger picture, which I will learn to point at. This was actually over a dry creek bed in Kuluktuk, and I show this because the children are playing. This is a grade 3 or 4 class. They're doing an activity on a field trip called sliding, which means that they basically get to the top of this hill and throw themselves down. Right? There's no equipment. There's just their snowsuits. They're pretty hard on their clothes. And the hunter called out to some of them to not wander too far from the group. And I looked at him, he looked at me, and he said, well, we're just careful right now because a grizzly bear's been spotted in town. Right? So they're there. Actually, one was just shot the week before this photo was taken. Right? So stories of hunting and stories of the land. And there's this really strong narrative among the people I heard at the caribou hearings, that if you're not out there on the land, then I don't believe you, because you haven't lived through these cycles. So we're still a little doubtful about your science, right? So lived experience in place, these cycles, still don't know whether they're 60 years or 70 years, but cycles matter. But other things also matter. It's the unpredictability of the land, because we actually don't know where the safe sea ice is all the time anymore. It's shifting too fast. These patterns are changing. We encounter more surprise hazards on sea ice. Right. Summer is longer and hotter, and winters are shorter, and the really cold Arctic days are fewer. These are some of the things you pick up. They're all signs of climate change happening, but not anything deliberatively spoken. It's sort of, in casual conversation when you talk about what did you do last summer, right? Mm-hmm. So all these things about the land. So the land is not just a place where people go to hunt and fish. It's where they go to learn about their world, to learn about their culture. It's a place that it's the repository of their memories. Their cultural history is embedded in the land. So learning about that and listening to what they have to say about that becomes part of how we understand climate change. Right? And so what I would suggest is that we need to, when we talk about climate change up there, and when we talk about climate change period, is that to understand Inuit lifestyles and how they engage with climate change, we need to understand that's in the context of this constant adaptation and constant change, right? And they haven't been having this conversation for the last 23 years, which is how long the annual conference of the parties meetings have been held. They've been having these conversations for the last 60 years, 70 years. Right? They've seen these changes for a long, long time. Right? They've seen changes in wildlife declines and demographic shifts and changing economies. They're worried about other things besides climate change because they're more immediate. So to go up to someone and talk about climate change, well, they might be more concerned about talking about the fact that there's a real shortage of housing. Right? They're going to prioritize discussion around employment opportunities and educational attainment because few kids actually finish high school, the regular school system, in the normal time. So a graduating class from high school will have a 6-year age difference because it's that dysfunction is there, right? And you need to talk about also cultural loss and genocide and renewal in the context of climate change, because for some of them anyway, these global conversations around climate change is yet another intervention, right? And we need to engage with that as well, right? So political participation in self-government has been one of the responses. That's why Nunavut came into existence, right, 18 years ago. And climate variability is a constant reality as well. So what is new about climate change? And are we talking about the same thing even? And it really struck me because my very last research interview this May when I was up there, I was talking to a really respected Inuit hunter in Cambridge Bay. He had just sat with me for 90 minutes talking about how he'd seen all the changes in the land over the last 40 years since his honeymoon with his wife. It was a beautiful lyrical story that he talked about seeing the landscape get greener every year as he passed the same places. And then at the end of it, at first I was thinking, I'm really excited. Someone's finally talking to me about climate change. And then I would listen to him some more, and I thought, actually, are we talking about the same thing? And so I just asked him flat out, so do you think climate change is permanent? And he said, no, it's cyclical. So when we go up there to get these stories about climate change, there's still these disconnects, these sort of barriers in language that might actually affect our understanding of what they're experiencing. Right. So some preliminary findings now. I would argue, first of all, that we need to consider spatiality. We need to consider that there are spatial differences in Nunavut in terms of how different populations engage with conversations around climate change. And in Cambridge Bay especially, because it is a central place, it's a place where that economy is diversifying, where that political power is focused in a place like Cambridge Bay. They are perceiving climate change potentially differently because they don't engage with the environment as much as in proportion to other communities. So you might get more variety in terms of who you're speaking to, right? And IQ, indigenous knowledge, the interaction with the land does shape response and adaptation. And Cambridge Bay might be experiencing more limited climate change communication because there are fewer people engaging with the land. And but even if they don't think they have a lot to say, I found everybody has a lot to say about climate change in these communities, but they don't frame it that way, right? So that's why it can't be deliberative. You need to listen to all the stories. You need to look at every source and think of it as a source to understand what's going on, right? It's not just about focused respondents. It's not just about selecting a sample. It's about hearing everybody, whoever they are, right? And I'm sneaky, so I started busting into the school. So I have open license to go into the elementary schools in Kuluktuk now to talk to the kids. And I'm working on how to bridge that, right? And temporality as well, because Inuit observation and experience of climatic time and cycles might not be in sync with ours, right? So we need to take that into account as well. So these spatial temporal communication effects are there, right? What time do we have? Just, okay, so here, now I'm going to scale up a bit. I've been talking very much about the local environment of Talk for Climate Change, and I want to frame Nunavut climate change communication in terms of some broader phenomena, such as the fact that they defer to elders even though the authority and the place of elders is shifting. We're looking at communities where elders are trying to figure out how they belong in this new Nunavut. Right? And some are abused as well, right? We're looking at communities where some of the kids say, we want to talk about climate change, but no one will talk to us, right? So we need to cross these generations to talk about strategies for engaging with this problem that we have, right? There are different communication cohorts and different social ecological adaptations depending on which group you talk to. So I'm starting to ask questions around, will I get different responses depending on how I bracket out these different groups, right? What they do in terms of their livelihood, their age, their activities, what have you, right? Their engagement with researchers, right? And also, I picked the Kitutnu region specifically by accident, but now specifically I'm going to stay there because if you look online and try to find information about Western Nunavut as opposed to Nunavut generally, there's a lot less information. We know a lot of stories and research and data about Nunavut from the vantage point of the larger Inuktitut-speaking population. But there's actually really very little social science research about Western Nunavut. I have had a really hard time finding it. And Nunavut communication, pieces of story, pieces of time, little snippets here and there, and they don't come easily in interviews. Right? I was talking to a high school teacher who said, well, her mother, who is an elder, her mother suddenly stopped in the middle of doing dishes and commented on the position of the moon, right, and how it had shifted since her childhood. And those are moments that you want to be able to capture. but you're not going to capture them by sitting down and say, let's have a sit-down interview now. And you can't whip out your tape recorder as soon as she says it. Could you repeat yourself now? I want to get this on tape. So we need to think about how we're doing research in these places. And representing Inuit realities means work with us, which is a refrain I heard a lot from Inuit delegates at the climate change negotiations. So I've added this picture, which is, it really struck me when I was up in Nunavut. This was a bumper sticker that Nunavut-Tungavik, so one of the biggest bodies for Nunavut economic development up there. And it produced this bumper sticker that was actually for a while on the websites of all the Nunavut government agencies saying polar bears are okay, because Nunavut eventually took a position to not put polar bears on the CITES list of endangered species, right? And this is worlds away from images like this, right? This is, I see you're looking very confused by this. And that is exactly the face I've seen every time I have talked to an Inuit person about this image. Because most of the people I've talked to, actually all the people I talked to in Cambridge Bay and Kuluktuk with the Inuit Circumpolar Council were not aware that Arctic lives were being represented this way. And they're not pleased about it, right? So this here is, worlds away from the local realities of Inuit in the Arctic. This was, this is the Unbearable sculpture. It was an effort by the artist Yen Galchiot, pardon my pronunciation, with the World Wildlife Fund in Denmark. And there was a big crowdfunding campaign which produced the money to build this big copper bear that is impaled by this oil pipeline. And looking at the curve, it very nicely mimics the curve of population increase as well. Right? And it's etched with markers of climate change points along it. It was built for display at the 2015 climate change talks in Paris. It was staged at the Cité Universitaire in Paris. And it was a big deal. Like, this was a rallying point, right? This is how climate change is being represented on the global stage, right? But whose image is this? I would really challenge whose image this is. And here, same event. You can see the Arc de Triomphe in the background here, right? Arc de Triomphe. So this is the polar bear army that also rallied together behind this sculpture, right? And I'm pretty sure that nobody who's actually Inuit or indigenous is hiding behind those costumes, though I don't know for sure. But I would also ask, whose civil society is this? Whose image is this? Whose civil society is this? Who is representing the Arctic peoples and the Inuit in these global conversations? Right. So here, when I was at the COP23 talks in Bonn that were hosted by the Fiji Islands just in November, I was at a talk where the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council was presenting. And Canada, incidentally, is the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council right now. And she started by saying, you know what? You always see images of polar bears and seals when you think of the Arctic. I wanted to find images of people. And then she decided that she wasn't going to put up a slide at all because she couldn't find images that she was happy with. Right? So she complained that this is not how we represent what's really at stake here. Right? It's not just about polar bears and seals. And we are not against development. And we don't want you to save us. These are some of the messages I was getting from her. Right? And then the Pacific Warriors. This event in Bonn, hosted by Fiji, was called the Pacific COP because it was hosted by, for the first time, a small island developing state. These islands which are under really dire threat, they're the ones that were represented very vocally here. And here you have representing the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Fiji are in this picture, right? And the Pacific Warriors, they have various messages, but the main one is, we are not drowning, we're fighting, right? We are not victims of climate change. We are agents of our own change. right? We are trying to be proactive, right? And these sort of voices of climate change victimhood are really not interpreting themselves as only victims. And it's really at odds with the images that also are out there. The Unbearable sculpture made its way to Bonn as well this year, 2 years after Paris. It was out there right by Rheinau Park. So, you know, this is Beethoven's birthplace. It's very civilized. It's very green and lush. It was autumn, so it was, you know, very colorful. And the Unbearable sculpture was put in this park that was in a space between the two zones at the climate change negotiations. And it was juxtaposed against a sculpture of skinny, starving, dark-skinned people. Right. So this is this here is a blow-up of what's over here. And surrounding this lovely installation were statues of more skinny, dark-skinned people in tribal robes tied against trees. I didn't quite understand what was going on, but these were some of the images that were out there. Right, so I really started thinking, you know, what sort of communication landscape are we trying to navigate in terms of representing Arctic voices, right? And I would suggest that there are these global-local connections. What happens globally is going to affect what happens locally. So the Inuit are unfortunately in a position where they need to engage with these representations and how to alter potentially these representations if they're going to have an effective voice in climate change negotiations. And they're bound within, to use the geographic concept, a power geometry of global climate change negotiation. And that conversation about climate change is very globally led. Is it representative of local voices? I say we need to question that, right? And environmental governance and management in Arctic areas, in any area, but it's certainly in Arctic areas, is inseparable from the place particularities that shape experience and knowledge and adaptation in these areas. So we need to think about climate change as part of this story of communicative political adaptation, because I think that among the various adaptations that people are going to have to make in the age of climate change is that they need to get politically a lot more savvy. They need to be a lot more effective at governing their own images and representations. Right? So a critical engagement with the Inuit and understanding that this is complex Arctic communication space. So even for us as researchers, those of us who are showing up here, for instance, at the new Canadian High Arctic Research Station, you know, there's going to be more research and more outsiders and more paid work for hunters to take people out on the ice. But we need to also think, how do we engage communities as part of this, right? Because we're there, right? So do we have more community engagement? That's open to question. But this page here is from a feature in Canadian Geographic magazine over the summer. And the message that one of the local leaders with the Heritage Association says is that actually we need to do more. You need to get a lot more with it when it comes to dealing with the communities, your host communities, right? Because there's not enough engagement with researchers as well. So I'll leave you with just a couple of thoughts here. The Inuit are an oral culture, right? They do get to the point, but they get to it in ways that may seem indirect in other languages, in other scientific cultures, if you want. And the trick here, I think, is to learn how to listen. Right? It's not just about grabbing people and saying, let's sit down for a 90-minute interview or a 60-minute interview. It's about listening to everybody, even to the kids. I love talking to kids, though it's a research ethics minefield, because they really echo what else they're picking up in their communities. So listening is also central to Indigenous knowledge. It's part of their system of communicating that you're supposed to listen and not talk and not ask questions. So the importance of heeding other ways of telling facts and numbers, if you want, looking beyond deliberative communication and interviews and maps and meetings to non-deliberative communication around talk, being there, right? which takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money, right? And it's an adaptive methodology. It's one that looks at obstacles and gets around them. So this is just for fun, but this is me again, hard at work gathering stories in Nunavut, right? I was riding one of these kamatiks, these big sleds that truck the children out to the ice, right? I was gathering stories about polar bears and grizzly bears and sliding, and I couldn't walk for 3 days afterward because these things are really uncomfortable. They have no shocks of any kind, right? So in conclusion, I'd like to say Arctic peoples do have diverse perceptions about climate change, and among them is disbelief as well. There are a lot of people that I talk to who don't believe climate change is happening in the terms that we're talking about as something permanent. The governance and management of Arctic environmental change is shaped by these spatial communication politics. There is place effects on, there are place effects on communication, right? And climate change, as with all other stories about environmental change, is about political adaptation as well, right? It's about claiming agency and power. And I would close by saying we need to learn to listen better, and we need to listen to people on that periphery. So just before I close, I'd like to just acknowledge my funding agencies, because thank you very much for helping me get up there. University of Calgary, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, as well as Polar Knowledge Canada. And I would open it to questions if you have, or comments or stories, if you have anything to add. Thank you. Oh, yes. No.
Because when you speak with cycles, I guess it would take maybe 2 or 3 before you realize, oh, maybe there's a problem because this could be one. Right? So.
That is a really interesting question, and it's actually one of the sort of tangents I'm going off on this is trying to figure out whether I need to start really targeting different populations in there. Because the kids, like you meet with the youth councils. I've met with the youth councils in Qaujimajatugangi and Cambridge Bay as well. And they say, there's too much inertia. They want their elders to talk to them. They want engagements. So they're not the ones that are doubting climate change. It's people like the 27-year-old mayor, right, who's saying, I've got so many other things to worry about. I don't really care about climate change. Right? It's just not an issue compared to housing and shelter and education and all sorts of other things. And then he called his brother in to talk to me. If you go to some place like the housing board in one of the hamlets, you just go there and they're all hunters, when they're not working there, right? So you can talk to 6 people all at once. And then he'd have his brother or a colleague show up and say, oh yeah, I believe in it, or I don't. And there's these huge differences in how they're viewing this within the same family. So I don't know, but I don't think the kids are the disbelievers necessarily. Yeah. Well, that was easy.
If you'd like to ask Dr. Tam any questions, you can come up to Earth Science's 10th floor and join us for some snacks and things. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.